Hey everybody, welcome to episode 7 of Brain Power. I'm your host, Bowen, and today joining me is Ryan Condron, CEO of Titan and founder of the Lumerin Protocol. I'm especially excited about this episode because Ryan and I were able to sit down in person and have a deep conversation about all things decentralized AI, ranging from the philosophy behind it, the implications and outcomes that we expect to see across broader society, and of course, the more detailed technical aspects of the network as well. Getting these technical insights from Ryan are especially significant as the Lumerin Protocol routing system for Bitcoin compute is the same system that was leveraged to create the routing system for Morpheus decentralized AI compute. So, without further ado, here is Ryan Condron.
I'm trying to free your mind, but I can only show you the door. You're the one that has to walk through it.
You're listening to Brain Power.
Okay, we are recording. Welcome to Two Dudes on a Couch, talk about crypto stuff.
All right.
No, so I would have already done the intro for Brain Power in general, but joining me in Decatur, I think it's Decatur, Texas. Decatur. We still don't know how to say it.
It's probably Decatur, yeah.
Yeah, we've been here for a few days, but joining me is Ryan Condron. I was going to say of Lumerin, but it's really of many things. So can you just, from the jump, give us a, who is Ryan Condron and a background on who you are in crypto?
Oh, boy. That's a good question. So I am the CEO of a company called Titan. Titan is a mining pool company that runs private mining pools for really large at-scale miners. I invented a protocol called Lumerin in 2018. I wrote a paper about the decentralization of control, this idea that if we could take one miner and we could remotely divide up the control of that miner in a decentralized fashion, then we can essentially decentralize the Bitcoin network, or keep the Bitcoin network decentralized by keeping the actual miners themselves and the control of them decentralized. So that was the original premise that led to the Lumerin Protocol and the Lumerin routing system. Before that, I got into crypto in late 2012, got very quickly plugged into the mining ecosystem, working on mining profitability calculators, hardware comparison sites, mining pools, and yeah, I've been doing data routing and Bitcoin mining and now AI compute routing.
How long ago? Do you remember what year it was when you first spun up a miner?
2012.
Okay, and it was specifically Bitcoin.
It was initially Bitcoin, but even towards the end of 2012, it was very, very difficult to mine with the GPUs that we had. The profitability wasn't that great. I mean, it was way better than it is today, but it wasn't that great compared to a lot of the altcoins that you could mine. So we actually found that if we mine the altcoins and then sell them and buy Bitcoin, we'd actually get more Bitcoin faster.
Okay, that makes sense. All right, that was a pretty good overview of yourself. Yeah, not to critique your overview. I'm just totally joking. But one thing I wanted to focus on was the compute routing design that you came up with and then initially implemented via Lumerin, but now has been adopted into the Morpheus ecosystem as kind of the proxy routing system for Morpheus compute. Can you dive into a little bit? Let's actually just to talk about what that actually means. So why did you invent the Lumerin system to begin with? What was the intention behind that?
Yeah, so as I said before, the general intention was the decentralization of mining hash power.
Okay.
So in the Bitcoin mining world, miners don't actually mine Bitcoins. They sell their hash power to a mining pool, and that mining pool typically will generate the Bitcoin because they're the ones that are slicing up the node space, divvying out the work to the miners. They're collecting the actual rewards and signing the blocks that are going on the network. So the miner in the mining farm is finding the golden nonce, if you will, that unlocks the block, but it's the pool that is actually signing the block. So the problem in Bitcoin land is that mining pools have historically become a point of centralization. Back in the day, BTC Guild self-regulated because they started to get over 50% of the network hash power. So they self-corrected and I believe they shut down because of it. We've since seen other pools do the same thing and self-regulate. Now we've moved into this era of this super pools where you have Foundry and Antpool that control over 75% of the network, where Antpool is actually acquiring other pools and then leaving them branded as another pool like Poolin or via BTC, but it's actually Antpool behind the scenes. Because of that, the Bitcoin network has become incredibly centralized on the block creation level, because if you take the top 4 mining pools based on hash power, they mint over 94% of the blocks.
Okay, so is it of the total hash power available, that high of a percentage of it is owned effectively by 2 businesses? So it's about like more than 90% of the total hash.
I'd say 4 businesses.
Okay.
So if you got 4 businesses to collude, they could censor 94% of the transactions.
Interesting. That is definitely not the public perception of Bitcoin.
No, and most people don't understand that concept of Bitcoin, and they haven't looked far enough under the hood to realize that this is the landscape of the ecosystem. And the reasoning for this is because you have these very, very large miners. If I showed you a toaster and I said, if you plug this toaster in, it's going to pay you $20 a day. First of all, you're going to plug the toaster in. Second, you're going to ask, how many
toasters can I buy?
How many toasters can I buy? And then where can I put them?
Yeah.
Where you can plug as many of them in. And this is essentially Bitcoin mining, is you have these ASIC miners that look somewhat like toasters, and you have anywhere on Earth where there's cheap electricity, a favorable government, and stable infrastructure, you have mining facilities popping up. And you get hundreds of thousands of these devices stuck in warehouses, and it's typically one person that is controlling, or you'll come down to a decision maker of where those devices are pointed.
Got it.
Right?
So what I'm effectively doing then via Lumerin is I'm purchasing the ability to use someone else's hardware.
Yes.
That was mining Bitcoin anyway, but I'm sure. But then I'm saying, hey, those rewards are effectively like who's managing that hash power is me, as opposed to Foundry or Ant or one of these other companies that is either directly doing the mining or passing it through another business entity.
Yeah. Essentially, if you had a mining facility in the middle of Texas with 100,000 devices in it, you could distribute that hash power one of 2 ways. Is you could unplug each device and you could sell it and send it to people all around the world, and now you've dispersed the hash power of 100,000 devices. Or you could sell off the control of those devices, and anyone around the world, say there's 100,000 different people controlling 100,000 different miners. Now you have more decision makers in the process, and they get to decide what pool they point the miner to.
This might be a silly question, but if I'm one of the people running the hardware and somebody else is using Lumerin or this model to access my hashing power, do I know which of my hardware they're actually tapping into?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. And the only reason I ask is because what came to mind was like, oh, well, if I wanted to censor them, I'd like unplug their machine basically. Yeah. Which in theory, I guess you could do.
So for a direct hardware rental service, it'd be like a 1-for-1 where I'm like renting this specific machine for this amount of time. Mm-hmm. What Lumerin has been building towards is what's more like a hash power grid, where all of these miners send their hash power into a centralized or a decentralized marketplace, and people buy hash power from the decentralized marketplace, and the miners will get what's called timeshares, right? So if someone buys 1 petahash over 24 hours, that might be fulfilled by 60 different
they don't necessarily know
machines.
Who on both sides. They don't necessarily know who's buying and who's supplying. It's just that they're agreeing on the contract.
Exactly.
Okay, this leads us actually into Morpheus, because now the same Lumerin model of compute is ultimately what the compute silo of Morpheus is built on. Can you talk into that transition? Like, what was your interest in AI, and how did what you would learn and the things that you decided to build to distribute Bitcoin hash power or Bitcoin compute translate now to a decentralized AI ecosystem?
Yeah. So on the Morpheus side, When I started talking to David, Scott, and Eric, probably early fall 2023, and started hearing about the way Morpheus was structured and what they wanted to do with it. And I started to dig, into the docs, and I started asking them, like, well, how are you doing the data routing piece? How are you doing the actual compute fulfillment? How are you doing these different aspects? And the answer I got back was, well, we have an economic engine for Morpheus laid out, but we don't have the specifics of the compute routing network yet. And that's when I realized, when I started looking at the documents of what they wanted to do, it was almost a direct overlay of what Lumerin had already built for hash power could be applied to AI compute.
Mm.
And we had already talked about a vision for Lumerin rolling into AI compute market. As early as 2021, 2022, we were talking about buying and selling compute using Lumerin. We've talked about buying and selling VoIP phone services and GPS signals. And there's all sorts of data streaming and routing that you can use with the Lumerin pattern. Partnering with Morpheus was a natural fit because they needed an AI compute router very quickly, and we could retrofit the hash power router specifically for that purpose.
Yeah, and can we just linger on the compute side of Morpheus for a little bit? So if the grand vision is to have a system where I, as an end user, somebody who wants to access a model or an agent, is trying to effectively, like we were saying with Bitcoin hash power, access the compute hardware resources that I need to run this thing on a permissionless basis that's encrypted, so that I don't necessarily need to care who's actually physically running the infrastructure, and they don't necessarily need to care or even know who I am as the user. The idea is, how do you build this grid, was the word I think you used before, of available intelligence, basically.
Yeah.
Right. And that's essentially what we're going for.
Yeah. It essentially is, you have compute providers all around the globe in a distributed manner, and you have compute consumers that will connect through a decentralized network, will open up a remote session, and then their device will open up a direct socket to the compute provider, and there will be a source and destination back and forth for inference.
How do you think it'll likely play out as far as, I think, sorry, let me take a step back. I think one of the biggest differences between Morpheus and then obviously what you were doing on the Bitcoin side of things is Bitcoin is one thing, meaning that everyone who's providing compute is providing the same algorithmic hash, basically. Yeah. But now we're kind of opening it up and saying, hey, you can pretty much provide in anything, really. Like, how do you foresee that kind of getting organized and then falling into place?
Not easily.
Fair.
So you're right. With Bitcoin hash rate, it's relatively easy because they're all using the same protocol, which is a stratum protocol. So the majority of the world's mining devices all communicate using the same language. They're all using the same hashing algorithm. The amount of data that is required in mining is actually very, very little. So mining is very easy compared to a compute network. When it comes to a compute network, we're dealing with LLM models, diffusion models, video generation models, all sorts of different types of big data, essentially, has been trained into these models, are hosted on a provider. And that provider is going to provide compute, supposedly, for these models for a user. Now we have to, when I say supposedly, it's a little tongue-in-cheek, because we have to track the interaction in a decentralized way that is completely anonymous, completely private, without exposing the user or their data.
Yeah,
it's not an easy problem to solve. So we created a pattern of both the handshake between the user and the provider that is anonymously signing transactions and submitting the transactions on chain in order to open up a session between the user and the provider. And then the session of data flow from the provider to the user is tracked by both nodes, and they are to agree on a final receipt.
Right.
So there's a whole pattern, and without getting into the weeds of how the pattern works, there's an entire pattern that has been built out around making sure that there's good actors And if there's bad actors, then they're disincentivized to continue using the system. And eventually providers that are bad actors will continue to fall in reputation score to the point where they'll be irrelevant in the system. So the trade-off is users can open up sessions with any provider for any type of LLM model, for any type of compute. Those sessions are tracked for real-time metrics, and those real-time metrics are reported back on chain to build a reputation for the provider.
Got it. So like over time, and I guess I just know just from talking with you in general that you're a fan of free markets. So over time, really the answer is the combination of the demand side of the equation, what users and agents and builders want to see in terms of available inference, available modeling, will balance itself with the supply of what people are willing to offer in combination with the reputation score. So it's really kind of like a 3-part problem to find like a market equilibrium. And really the idea is over time with enough incentive on both sides, we will like the network will find its own equilibrium basically. But it also has the freedom to adjust as the market demands for.
And that's the difficult thing, is building a system that is not controlled by a central entity or a benevolent dictator, but is truly free to find the equilibrium.
Well, I wanted to talk about that too. I'm glad you mentioned that, because you had mentioned this as well when you were talking about the Bitcoin side of things, that the real driving reason, or at least pretty much the big driving reason for having something like a Lumerin protocol, is that you don't have the centralization of all of the hash power being controlled by individual parties who, in theory, could censor the chain if they wanted to. Can you talk to me a little bit about why is decentralized compute so important for AI systems anyway? Like why does it matter anyway?
Yeah, and this is that's a deep question. When you start talking about the need for decentralization, so decentralized is not a yes or a no. Mm-hmm. It's a how much is required for the system that it's being applied to. So a system that is not very valuable could have could be adequately decentralized with 2 people.
Sure.
Right. As long as those 2 people agree on something, then the system works. As the system grows in value, the need for having more and more people as a decision maker to get to a consensus is important to keep the system from being exploited. So now that Bitcoin is over $1 trillion, it's very, very important for it to be very decentralized, to make sure that the amount of decision makers in the system is larger than 2 entities, 4 entities. It should be a very large amount of entities. Now, granted, in the Bitcoin space with pools, there are a lot of watchdog groups looking at these 2 pools or these 4 pools, and the moment they start sensing that they're censoring certain addresses or they're censoring transactions, it will be a very, very bad day for those entities simply because the press around that.
Well, and I guess just really quick, that's the beauty of a public ledger. Like that's why blockchain matters.
It can be audited.
Yes, it's not necessarily that it's impossible to influence, but the influence is transparent.
Yeah.
Right. Which sorry, go ahead.
So that's just on the Bitcoin side. So now we start moving into AI, right? And we talked about this earlier, where it's what is an LLM? What essentially is an AI model? It's if you took the whole of the internet of information and you put it into a box.
Yeah.
And now it's who do we want to entrust that box with, right? Well, this is where you have to decide how valuable is this information? How valuable? And if it's very valuable, then it needs to be really decentralized.
Right.
It means whoever controls that box, it needs to be spread across as many decision makers as possible.
Yeah, and what I think people need to think about too is the fact that if we look at a model as like all of the information on the internet, it is all of the information. Like I think when people think of it reminds me of, have you ever watched Parks and Rec? It reminds me of when Ron Swanson's at that restaurant and he's like, I want all of your bacon. And he's like, no. I wanted to make sure, I didn't say I want a lot of bacon. I said I want all of your bacon. And like, that's really what we're talking about here. Because when I say like big data systems, people, or even myself, I'll think of something like a Wikipedia. Well, a person is still, or people are still going in and manually updating those pages and those references on Wikipedia. We're talking about a machine that can scrape everything.
Yeah.
And so on the one side, you have the model side, which is what information has it scraped? And then among that information, what is that model filtering for? Because presumably there's always some type of filter. I don't think, right, because there's inherent weights in a model. So there's some type of bias. It's just a question of whether or not that bias is transparent, which is where you get into open source models versus proprietary.
Is the bias transparent, and does your worldview agree with the bias?
Yes, or are you willing to accept the outcome of the fact that that bias is being used? And that's I guess the differentiator between this is open source model, something like Llama or DeepSeek, versus this is ChatGPT or Grok or something that's proprietary. Yeah. But then we take it a step further and we say, okay, now you've crossed that chasm. You have the open source model. You can see what's in it, what it's trained on, what the weights are. But to you, the point you were just making, and I do want you to continue on this, who holds the keys to the access to that model? Because even with an open source model, if you have a centralized inference provider, they can still limit my ability as a user to actually access the model. And then even if they're not limiting my use case, they own all of that data. At the very least, that's their data now.
Yeah. So the analogy I'll often use of why this is important and what we're actually trying to achieve here is I'll tell a story about a guy named John Dunlap. And John Dunlap was an immigrant from Ireland, and he was given a document, and he was told to make copies of this document. He ended up making 200 copies of this document and spreading it all over the place. And actually, as of today, I believe only 26 of the original 200 still exist, right? And the reason why 26 still exist out of the 200 is because the document that he copied, he actually copied it about 200 years ago, right? And if we didn't have those 26 copies, we'd have no authentic comparison and basically proof of the authenticity for the Declaration of Independence, right? So John Hancock gave him the Declaration of Independence. He was a printer.
Yeah.
And he said, make copies of this and distribute it. So he made 200 copies. He distributed it. Now, as of today, only 26 copies exist. But if those 26 copies didn't exist and all we have is the original signed copy, there is no way we can...
How do you verify that it hasn't been altered? You cannot verify
that it hasn't been altered. Mm-hmm. So now we come back to this idea of trained AI models and trained LLMs. If the only copy of human knowledge was OpenAI or a DeepSeek or something that was set to a certain bias, right? Or if the government says that you can only access this AI model because that's sanctioned and it's approved by the US government, or China says you can only access this model because it's sanctioned by the CCP, then now you have an issue of authenticity of truth.
Yeah.
But with something like Morpheus, anyone around the world can host a model, and they can be completely anonymous, and they can be compensated for it completely anonymously. Anyone else around the world can access that model. They can ask questions against it. They can create images against it. They can create video against it. And they can do it completely anonymously with compensating the provider completely anonymously. That's freedom of access.
Yeah.
And you can't censor it. You can't lock it down. You can't control it. And because of that, it doesn't matter what governments want to do to try to control AI as far as weights and biases and how you use it. As long as Morpheus ecosystem survives, then there will be freedom of access.
Yeah. When actually, you just made me think of something. I focus a lot on, when I talk about the ecosystem, I focus a lot on the open source models. But technically, you can access closed source models through the Morpheus ecosystem as well.
Yes.
Like if you're a business and you trained a proprietary model, you could still register it as a model that a compute provider's, you or another compute provider is providing to the ecosystem. And I, as a user, can still permissionlessly access it and own my own data, even though your model's proprietary. Like I'm partial to the open source models, and I tend to focus on that. But to the point you were just making, like that's not the only way of using it. and it might not even be the best way of using it all the time.
If I had, for example, a WikiLeaks style data download,
Yeah.
and I wanted to disperse that to a group of people completely anonymously in a highly trained AI model that's been trained on this information, I don't want to release the model. Maybe it has proprietary information in there. I don't want people to
Or like
copy
sensitive
or
content, or some
whatever.
sensitive thing.
Or if I painstakingly gather this information and I want to retain control of it because I want to be compensated for it, I could create a website and charge access to it, but that's not anonymous.
Mm-hmm.
Or I could, go through the Tor network, or I can do, dark web stuff in order to try to get myself compensated for it. Or I could release the model on Morpheus as an anonymous provider, and anyone can connect to it and use it.
And you're getting paid in that scenario, you're the compute provider effectively,
And
who's hosting your own
model
system, basically.
Yep.
Yeah, that people are then running to access to. Yeah, that's a great example. I haven't heard anyone use that yet, but that makes a ton of sense.
And that's a more clandestine, thing. What if I'm Pfizer and I have all these lab trials and information about my drugs and products and services and employees, and I want to provide access to this model, right? Yeah. Well, I could release that on Morpheus. I can still retain the core model itself without releasing that, but I can provide access to it. And now, depending on who opens a session to my Morpheus node, I could say, well, this set of addresses can access the model through these filters. This set of people can access the model through these filters, right? Now I created a decentralized way for companies and entities to release information in a controlled way without releasing all of the information. It's uses like this that I really think are going to be the future for AI agents, for companies. I really foresee a future where websites are a thing of the past, where if I want information about a certain product, I'm not going to go to that company's website. I'm going to talk to that company's agent.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, you're going to talk to your own agent who finds that company's agent.
Right.
I mean, right. I'm being a little tongue in cheek, but also not, because this is really the ultimate path I think we get to is we have agentified Ryan who can interact with all the other agents. So you're not manually searching for anything. It'd be like if you had your own personal Google who was like, hey, I want it, or a better example might be, you're going to use the Apple App Store. And we actually used this as an example last night as we were talking. Back when the App Store first came out, the slogan was there's an app for that. And all of the time, I remember thinking of things or being like, oh, this is a thing that I do online. I wonder if there's an app for that. Well, I won't have to wonder if there's an agent for that because I'll just have an agent at my disposal who can tell me.
Yeah.
Like a central place to go to contact all the rest of them.
That's right. And on top of that, if I am a company and I have trained an agent on my data and I don't necessarily want to be the compute provider, but I want people to get access to my agent and my company's information through the agentic communication, then I can put up a bounty for a provider then to pick up that agent off of Morpheus and provide my agent. So I could have people, in China and all around the world, almost like a CDN, providing my company's agent for a fee, and they're collecting money for providing information on the Morpheus network through the agent. So there's a lot of I guess it boils down to decentralized access to information. And that's really the key of Morpheus. I likened it early on to the spider web, where agents are the spiders and Morpheus nodes are the spider web, where we're providing the interconnectivity and the communication for access to all the data for the AI agents to be able to crawl across and to get whatever information they need.
Right. Yeah. Well, Definitely, that's actually the first time that I've heard that analogy, but I do like it. It's good. I was thinking about the fact that on top of everything we were just talking about, which is obviously the access to the intelligence and the information, is also the ability to do stuff with that information, which is why it's so important that this is built on top of crypto rails. So one of the things I love about Morpheus is that it's built on crypto rails, but I would not personally consider it a crypto project. because the product really isn't crypto per se as much as it leverages crypto to do all of these various things. And I think that that's an important distinction because, sorry, I'm trying to convey the message I'm trying to get across.
Yeah. So, couple examples, right? So Filecoin.
Yes.
Filecoin and IPFS. IPFS is not a crypto project, right?
Right.
Filecoin is. Filecoin provides a compensation mechanism on top of file storage for incentivizing people to use IPFS in that network, right? Storage network does the same thing. Arweave does the same thing. It is a compensation system that is built on top of a non-crypto.
Yeah, what I'm trying to say is
system.
People do not necessarily need to care about crypto specifically to care about Morpheus. I think there's a lot of overlap between the two, but technically speaking, like the one is using the other's technology to function. And the only reason I'm even bringing this up is because I know that historically there's a lot of people in the AI space who don't really love the crypto space. And especially right now, a lot of the publicity that crypto is getting is not exactly like high utility, great fundamental use cases. It's like, hey, we're back to the gambling casino, which is like, fine, whatever, it is what it is. But I think drawing this differentiation of being like, no, this is a product and service that will ultimately exist that you can use for everything, but it lives on top of crypto rails, which allows it to have the private transactions. It allows you to do self-custody. It allows agents to actually interact with value. Because right now, I'm sorry, but there's no near future where I can go to Perplexity or ChatGPT or Grok and have it move money out of my bank account or invest money on my behalf. I just don't see that happening unless if they build their own internal systems for that.
Well, then they need a money transmitter license and they need a brokerage license.
Are they a bank? Are they an investment advisor? Are they is my agent on Grok going to need a Series 7 to trade securities for me or give me advice? I mean, that's ridiculous. But my smart agent that runs on top of crypto rails does not need any type of licensing to access my wallet that I give it access to.
Yeah.
Which is so important. And I think that's incredibly novel, even just among AI projects and DAI projects. I also like to highlight too that, to my knowledge, Morpheus is the only project in the very specific market segment that we're in. There's a lot of people building in DAI, but most of them are focused on either building agents themselves, which is great. We support them. Literally, the Morpheus ecosystem supports those people building agents, or they're training models. Great. You need to publish your model somewhere to actually have users who access it. And we're in this very specific niche of routing the two, as well as with the hardware compute providers, that I don't know that anyone else is focused on, which is part of why this was so exciting.
Yeah, I have come across, since the advent of Morpheus, I have come across a few other projects that are trying to focus just on the inference piece and the decentralized compute piece. I don't know what traction they've made, but I will say for Morpheus, what makes it very, very unique is the way they did the initial token issuance with the fair launch, the way they have their coding rewards, their builder rewards, and the compute rewards. The way they structured everything and how it's been executed on is very unique. And then when you pair that up with the amount of OGs in the space, like basically crypto people that got in 2011, 2012, 2013, and they're all incredibly excited about Morpheus, and they're throwing their weight behind it to the degree where the discussions that I've heard this time and time again was, oh, well, we did it like this in this network, that we launched in 2012 or 2013, and that didn't work out. So then we tried this, and this, and this, and those didn't work out, but we should have done it like this. And this was the lesson learned 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And that's all being applied into Morpheus now. So it's getting this collective wisdom from, over a decade of experience from so many different developers and engineers that have been in the space. I haven't seen anything like it.
Yeah, I also love too that just some of the people as well that I know working on the project are people who have been into AI systems since the 90s in some cases, and just didn't have the means to build the thing. It's like their ideas were too far ahead of the actual technological abilities at the time, but now we're there. Yep. And this is stuff that we can actually do literally today. It's just getting it all organized, drawing the incentives, and then having the market really take care of itself. Can we talk? I want to get back to the philosophical conversation.
Okay.
So we were having some deep philosophical talks earlier that I wish I could have captured to some degree. But how do you see these tools and like the AI landscape changing society just in general? Like, are there parts of society that you are really keen on paying attention to that you think will change with all of these things?
It's going to be fascinating. So, I've had the fortune to be able to travel quite a bit over the last few years, and I've seen a lot of different cultures and societies, and the way certain cities function, and whether it be third world or first world, I've seen kind of the gamut over the last 3 years, and the one thing that I'm noticing is, and it doesn't always sound good to say it, but the degree of economic difference, so basically your lowest of low class versus your highest of high class, the further that gap is, there seems to be a larger amount of development in that city or area. So Dubai, for example. Dubai has had a huge amount of growth over the last few years, but they have a very, very large wealthy class, but they also have a very, very large lower class, right? So the service class is incredibly large. So there's this crazy economic difference, and that seems to, and then you pair that with really good governmental systems that oversee things in an efficient manner, and it's created a crazy, like, futuristic style society. Whereas when I was fortunate enough to be able to go to Cairo and Giza recently, and you see a city of like 22 million people where the average income of the person is between $150 and $200 a month, right? So it's incredibly impoverished. But you don't see the same type
I was going to say there's no like specific noticeable wealthy class, or at least not in any like large number.
Yeah, and you don't see the development. So that's in part by the way the government functions there, and in part by the willingness of people to invest in the economy from like a very wealthy class standpoint. Why did I say all this? And what's the fundamental point of this, right? Is AI is introducing an incredibly inexpensive lower class.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
An AI agent essentially
can be
the
agent
worker,
itself is.
Right?
I see.
I don't need to hire a team of Filipino call center workers when I can spin up 1,000 agents that can answer phones for me.
Yeah.
Right. Now, the crazy thing is that's not just available to me, but that's also available to people in Botswana or Ethiopia or El Salvador. They can do the same thing.
Yeah.
They can spin up these agents that are nuclear engineers, that are physicists, that are material scientists. They can spin up agents that will know how to do things.
Accounting. It's all
exactly.
Like, even as simple stuff, not simple, but like very like everyday things that you
So unprecedented access to education, unprecedented access to professional services, unprecedented access to content creation, right? It is going to change and revolutionize basically any country that embraces AI and the learning capabilities of AI, and the faster they integrate it into their society, they are going to grow with leaps and bounds compared to other societies.
So I agree with you. That makes sense.
Right.
And now my question would be is, how does this change the organization? Let me take a step back. So your assumption was that a nation state adopts the technology and they can basically have infinite labor, essentially, for whatever thing is capable from an AI, but this also requires them to redistribute the wealth that's being accumulated. Like, my fear is that the people at the top are going to have the knowledge and the capabilities to access these types of systems, and so they can just replace the lower class without actually subsidizing the lower class if they don't want to.
Keep the knowledge.
I personally think, well, this is the question.
Yeah.
The ability to not gatekeep the knowledge will be there, but how we actually organize who we distribute those resources and information to, I think that's the most interesting question.
Yeah.
Because I do not personally think it's going to be the nation state. Because this is operating under the assumption that the nation state is acting in the best interest of their people. I could show you a million different ways that even the United States, I mean, we're seeing this now with Doge and all these things.
So you have to remember that we're operating out of the Western mentality, right? The Western mindset is we are incredibly, I'm trying to think of the word, skeptical of our government.
Yes.
Right. So we don't inherently trust our government to be efficient, to be smart, to be trustworthy. Like, we trust our military, right? Because that's been ingrained in us. Being Americans, that's been ingrained in us since we were a little kid.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, I usually just assume that my tax dollars would be better spent literally set on fire, because at least they'll keep someone warm.
Yeah.
Hyperbolic. But but that's actually like the feeling that a lot of us have, I think, about how the money's being spent.
But that is our worldview, and we've been conditioned because we've been raised in Western society. That is not the entire world. There are nation states where they look at their government as very trustworthy. They look at their government as in their best interests. And it's not even just from a source of, pride and patriotism, but it's just they've grown up or been raised in a very, very different culture than we have, right?
Well, I know. Do you think that this stems all the way back from things even much smaller scale than that? So, like, for example, there's a lot of cultures where the cultural norm is, as you grow up in life, your parent becomes a dependent of you effectively.
Mm-hmm.
And like, there's multi-generational families that live together in many, many, many different cultures where that's not really a Western ideology.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, for most people, the Western ideology is, unless if you're somebody who's like wealthy enough to just like throw money at it, how many people are basically like, they live separate from their parents, and then their parents eventually go off into a home somewhere and they see them sometimes.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like viewed as, I already know, like despicable relative to like from the perspective of some other cultures where they have multi-generational living.
Yeah.
So do you think that like that kind of starts at that like much smaller level and then scales up to things like trust of the government? Like, are these the same cultures you're talking about, or do you think there's like not necessarily a connection?
My point being with bringing that up is, we apply a lot of our understanding and worldview to global mechanics.
Yeah.
And that's not always an accurate way of doing it, right?
Sure.
So what I can say is the best thing, and I'm just going to bring it all around and pull us out of the rabbit hole a little bit. What I'm saying is the best thing we can do for the human race is provide freedom of access to the knowledge through the Morpheus network. And then however different communities or governments or people groups are going to use that knowledge, that is entirely up to them.
Right.
As long as they have access to the knowledge.
Yeah. Like, the network itself is completely agnostic to the use case, which is a feature of the network. Like, that's actually like the point. Like, that's one of like the major things that makes it so great. It's funny. I'm finding myself being the pessimist here, which I'm usually not. I'm usually like the eternal optimist in everything. I just, when you start incentivizing, my fear is just the scenario that you were talking about playing out, which in theory should be a great thing, because in theory, a nation state being able to offload all of that labor and then use it for their own economic benefit and then disperse it back to the people is great. But if they choose not to do it now, I could kind of solve my own problem here by saying that in any individual group of people, you don't necessarily have a wealth gap issue if the people at the bottom are still better off than like they would have been otherwise. Even if the gap between the top and the bottom is like 10 miles wide, if the bottom in your nation state is better than 90% of
the middle of the rest of the world, then it doesn't really matter how wide the gap is as long as like the people are being taken care of.
Well, you have to understand, the wider the gap, the larger the political opportunity.
Yeah. The thing I wanted to get
That's
to,
what happens in America.
Yeah. I went like really down this rabbit hole, but the thing I was trying to get to is I think that the way in which we organize ourselves is going to fundamentally change because of things like this. So like, for example, if you built an agent or you built a system of agents for like your, I don't know, like your religious community or like a sports community or like some other type of way that you're organizing yourself and saying, I identify with this person.
Yeah.
You could actually use that extra brain power to create like economic flourishment for whatever that community is that you're deciding to align with. And it transcends physical geography.
Yeah. So, and you have to remember too, that when everyone has access to these systems, then it's raising the entire bar, right? Like the ocean is raising. So yes, all the boats will raise with it, but you have to remember that the competition for this stuff is going to get crazy. Right?
Yeah.
So just because I can automate an agent now and 90% of the world can't, you fast forward 2 years when 99% of the world is automating agents, then the cost of labor, services, and content has become so cheap, so intense, right? It's like, how do you overcome that?
Yeah.
And what I would say in regard to that, or I would just, one more point on that is, if you think about in India, for example, you have these large development firms where you'll have hundreds and hundreds of engineers, like coders that work for these firms.
Mm-hmm.
If they get laid off because they get replaced by AI, what do these guys do?
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. I think I was having a conversation with somebody else recently in a similar vein, basically saying that, so this person's argument was, a lot of people think these AI tools are going to free up all of this space and time for people to just do nothing, basically, because it's being taken care of for them. But that doesn't work in a perfect market, because in a competitive market, even if there's 99 out of 100 people say, well, I can like do less, I can personally do less because now these tools are better. If even one person says, whoa, wait, I can do 10 times the output, but so if I work 10 hours a day, now I'm doing 100 times the work, and somebody else is looking at it and saying, well, I only need to work 1 hour a day and I can do 10 hours of work. But the market will find its own equilibrium. And if anybody is willing to put in the extra effort in combination with the new tool, then the whole thing just moves further.
That's what
you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, we're on the verge of an escalation.
Yeah. So like what happens though? Like what about the people who want to be actively involved, but they don't really have a means to, because they are effectively worthless to the market now?
Yeah.
And I don't mean that to be like, it sounds like harsh, but I do think that it's a hard reality.
I think it's very valid, right? You have a lot. Okay. I mean, we'll move out of the third world and we'll move back into, say Southern California,
sure.
LA. You have all these content influencers.
Yeah. I mean, this, like what I'm doing right now. Yeah.
Yeah. Right now, you could generate a full podcast of two AIs talking together. You give them a subject, they will riff off each other.
Yeah.
And they will generate all the audio in real time and you won't know the difference.
Yeah. It exists right now. There's a couple shows doing this.
Yeah.
There's one that's printing like 4 episodes a day.
Yeah.
And it really just sounds like two people talking. Yeah, totally.
And they'll do that. So content is going to become infinitely cheaper. Like over time, it's just going to keep getting crazier and crazier and crazier to the point we don't know what's real. We don't know what's not real.
I have a take on this.
Right.
Go ahead. Yeah.
We don't know what is human generated. We don't know what is computer generated. You have a lot of content creators that have spent a lot of money building a brand, and they could quickly be overtaken by someone that is generating content with a lot less effort.
Right.
Right. Mm-hmm. And this is, I believe it was, I can't remember Perry. I'm terrible with Hollywood names. But
Tyler Perry.
Tyler Perry. Yeah. There it is. Tyler Perry was going to drop $1 billion into a film studio or something, but then someone showed him a high-res AI generated video, and he pulled the plug on the project.
I was like,
right?
What am I doing?
And now that's something several people told me. I don't know how true that is, but it's underscoring the point that investment in traditional spaces and content generation spaces might not be the wisest thing to do at this point.
Right. Although, so my counterpoint to this is it will become more novel to have things that were genuinely created by people.
Right.
So for example, for the longest time, everything that you bought for hundreds of years, more, thousands of years, everything that you bought was presumed to have been made by a person until large-scale manufacturing took place. And now, when you buy anything, you assume that it was made in manufacturing unless if it otherwise notes to you made by hand, which always costs a premium. I mean, a Rolls Royce is partially what it is because it's made by hand. Yeah. Right? So
it always costs a premium if you can tell the difference.
Yeah. Right. Okay. I see it. Yeah.
The assumption, and this is a huge problem in the luxury market, is the whole thing of knockoffs. Yeah. And when the knockoffs are coming out of the same factory as the authentic ones, it can't tell the difference.
Yeah. Or there maybe really isn't. Yeah.
I ran into this in Egypt when I was talking to one of the guides about antiquities and things people were digging out of the mountains and they were selling. Even in Luxor to this day, a lot of the locals are just digging mines all over the hills around Luxor looking for artifacts. And they find them and they sell them on the Egyptian black market. And there is this whole parade of 3,000, 4,000-year-old objects being sold on the black market because it's the locals are digging them out of the hills. Yeah. Right? But it's matched with just as much Chinese knockoffs in the black market being passed off.
So you don't necessarily know.
You don't necessarily know. Yeah. And the only answer he could give me for being able to tell the difference was, well, you have to have an Egyptologist actually look at it and authenticate it.
Wow. Yeah.
I'm like, so that's I'm trusting this guy to be able to.
Well, so to that point then, won't it be the case that anything that you see online, you will just assume is not real unless if it's otherwise proven to be real?
That'll most likely be the case.
So some type of I don't want to say KYC, but I guess it is really some type of KYC and not necessarily controlled by a centralized entity, but probably on a blockchain, right? Some type of KYC of this is me, I am me, I actually created this thing.
So this is a matter of trust. How do you trust the source of something? Yeah. Well, the premise of cryptocurrency is that you can't. Yeah. So we created, the majority of us has spent over a decade now creating systems that are trustless. Right. Right.
Well, and this is why the DAI is so important, though, because if I'm using a centralized system on any given day, how do I know that they didn't tweak? How do I know that Elon Musk didn't troll Sam Altman on Twitter yesterday such that Sam Altman made 2 phone calls and now all of a sudden the model's a little bit different? Yeah. Right? There's no way for me to verify that.
There is no way.
At all. And so you need a system where that is verifiable, that what you're using is what you think you're using. Now, the thing is, most people, though, realistically aren't going to be doing that. So there's still going to be some type of trusted third party as far as auditing goes. And I guess I don't know what the solution for that is other than I trust the people who you trust that know what's going into it.
The trust problem, this is why Bitcoin is so revolutionary, is it because it solved the trust problem using proof of work for the double spend issue. Right. There isn't currently a solution for the trust problem with content. A lot of people have proposed different ideas of how do we watermark AI-generated content. How do we create a watermark for user or real person-generated content? Right. How do we tell the difference between the two? It's funny. It's even the diamond industry is going through this.
Yeah, right? I almost mentioned when you were talking about the artifacts, I almost brought up the diamonds because we can now make chemically identical diamonds. Yes. My understanding is the only way to tell the difference is that the chemically created ones are better typically because they don't have the blemishes that you would have through a natural process.
And the artificial diamond labs diamond labs have started introducing flaws into their diamonds specifically
this is
now.
so ridiculous.
So that you cannot tell the difference.
Yeah, well, the
right?
podcast AIs that you were talking about do this. They do say they do say like, because they want it to sound human. They don't want it to sound like AI because no one wants that.
So any of your followers or watchers can test this. Open up ChatGPT and they have a part of the app where you can talk to it and ask it questions, voice chatting.
Sure. And
just ask it to count from 0 to 100 as fast as it can. And what you'll find out it'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and it will.
Does it really?
Yeah, it pauses to take a breath. And
I might plug in the sound of it doing this here. Yeah,
you should try it. And sometimes it'll get pretty far. Sometimes it'll get to 30 or 35.
But it'll take a breath.
And it'll take a breath. And then you say, why did you do that? Why did you stop to take a breath? And it'll say, oh, well, it sounded more natural. Like, okay, well, can you do it without taking a breath? Can you go from, and they might have changed it, but the last time I did it was a couple months ago and it could not do it. So when you asked it not to do it, it still did it. So it's,
which obviously it can do. So they coded it.
It's like a post-processing thing that they add to it to make it more human-like, that it can't get rid of it.
Interesting.
Right? So we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot here as we're racing towards this singularity of robots that you can't tell the difference if they're a human or a robot.
Yeah.
It communicates like a human. It looks like a human. And we're really just wanting to go into the sci-fi movie where the only thing you can do is really cut its skin and see blue blood and realize that it's a robot and not a human.
Yeah. Which I struggle with this because on the one hand, it's a good thing because all of the systems will be so great. But the thing that I keep coming back to is what about the people who just get effectively socially replaced by these things? Like, what do they do? Or
humans are adaptable, right?
I know that that's actually the answer. I know the actual answer is, listen, they'll figure it out because that's what we do.
Yeah.
Or if we don't, then we'll cease to exist. And so and
it's not our job to figure it out for them. It's our job to figure it out for ourselves.
But I want to figure it out for them.
I know. Well, I'm more concerned about what am I going to do when I'm replaced by an AI agent, I
guess I should be very clear. I keep saying these people. I'm projecting here, you guys. Yeah. What do you mean, you people? Yes. I'm just a dude talking to Mike, pretending to be another dude. Okay.
Right.
Yeah. No, it literally is like that though, where, I guess to your point, I should really focus on what I'm going to do. But these are all the questions that I really think about all the time with this stuff. And it's coming, there is no slowing down, and humans are famously bad at projecting exponential growth. This is why, Warren Buffett says that compound interest is the eighth wonder of the world or whatever. It's because people are so bad at really understanding compound growth. And this is literally compound growing every day, every hour.
You can't.
I don't know.
Up.
Yeah, faster than I can explain to you. As I'm talking, the systems are getting better.
Yes.
It's really hard to think about.
And this is what's so hard doing a startup in this space or a new project in this space is by the time you've thought about it, had a meeting about it, and started to design it, someone has already built it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Well, especially when you have something like Morpheus, where how many code contributors are there currently? Almost 300?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so think about it. You have almost 300 people working on, and more. I mean, as many as want to jump in, please do. And you don't need my permission to do it. By the way, it's all on GitHub. It's all public. It's all open source. But when you have that many people working on problems and then they're getting fixed and or solved, and there's no way for any one central. This is why centralized things ship so much faster. But then you run into all the problems we were just talking about of okay, well, which devil do you want? Do you want the quick product, but also now Sam Altman owns your brain? Or do you want to own your own brain? But
I can't tell you how many conversations I've had where it's kind of culminated into, okay, but why don't you just use Morpheus?
Yeah.
You could build it from scratch, but why don't you just use Morpheus?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, you could do that, but why don't you just, I don't know, start a builder's project and use Morpheus?
Yeah, well, this is one thing I love about the builder's ecosystem is that it just completely creates a system where if an idea, I was going to say if the idea is good enough, but it's really about the execution. If the execution of the idea is good enough, it will be created. because people will support it and they will have access to the resources that they need to survive. This is no longer a world where, we were watching Silicon Valley and you're having to pitch to all these VCs to be like, please allocate money to my project and hopefully I don't burn through it and I can allocate it correctly. This is like, no. The community speaks for itself. And if you're creating a product or service or agent that it speaks to people, the inference will come to you and now you can propagate.
Yeah.
And this is also through the lens of like a person building something. What happens when an agent registers itself as a builder and is now attracting more tokens and compute automatically?
So as far as like the antiquated model of raising money with VCs, so Morpheus has a bucket for that, right? The capital bucket, where traditional VCs, they can throw money into the capital bucket, they can get rewarded in more, and they can fuel the ecosystem. Mm-hmm. But you're exactly right. That's why we had a presentation a few days ago where we were talking about agents and Morpheus AI agents and where they're at and the different types of agents were going to be built. And I just made kind of the side comment of, why don't we just create an agent that can create other agents?
Right. What were you calling it? You made a comment out of a book. What was the book?
Oh, the the something machine. It was out of the Bobaverse books.
Yeah.
Jonathan knew the name of it. It was. I'm blanking out on the
That's
name
fine.
But it was basically a 3D printer that could print anything.
Yeah, like it could explore planets and then see what all the available resources are, and then among those available resources, print the thing that they need.
I literally wish Jonathan was right here now. He could shout the name of what this 3D printer thing was called. But essentially, it is the end all be all of agents is the agent that can build other agents. Right. And I do believe there's probably projects working on that right now.
Yeah. Well, and it'll probably come quicker than you think because again, like it's all growing exponentially and like, what's funny is like when you extrapolate that further and it's like, okay, now I have an agent that prints agents that prints other agents. And you just have this thing where it's like constantly, but this is also why when I was talking about intent-based use before, you're not going to need to sit through an app store and be filtering through 20,000 agents that are being printed in real time when you have, and this is the dividing line between like the paper that David had wrote recently, separating a smart agent from a super agent. The super agent is like the individual representation of you that's talking to all the other available agents. And it can have hundreds of thousands of those conversations all in one time. But it's going to happen so fast that like one person couldn't sit there and sift through all of it. It would make no sense.
Yeah. And the problem is we're trying to apply current system architecture to this new paradigm of agentic systems.
Right.
And I think we're putting ourselves in a box because right now, a lot of people, the way they talk about agents is like they're microservices. And, this agent is going to talk to this agent, this agent, this agent, this agent. And all those agents are going to, this agent does this specific service, this agent does this, right? And they're thinking that we're going to have this huge library of microservices, essentially, right? Yeah. That's an old world architecture. That's an old model that we're trying to apply on agentic behavior. The reality is these agents can be one-off systems that get created and then destroyed when their use is over with. They don't have to be microservices that are spun up and sit there waiting for someone to use them. And this is why having an agent that creates other agents is so powerful, is because all you really need is one agent. And that one agent creates what it needs to, when it needs to create it, use the system resources it needs to use. And then when it's done, it spins everything back down. And you don't have any residue of whatever existed.
That just blew my mind a little bit. I wasn't thinking of it in that capacity. Like I was thinking of it in it prints a new agent that can do a new thing, effectively a microservice, and then it just kind of like stagnantly exists. But actually, you don't need that because you only need it to exist for the time that you're using it.
So check this out. I consume a lot of very random information.
Yeah.
Right. I'll watch documentaries, read random books or whatever. Back in the time of like the explorers of Captain Cook and Magellan and stuff, there was a known legend that explorers passing across India or via boat, like Australia along the Indian Ocean, they'd always stop at the mouth of the Nile, or at the mouth of the Ganges River, and they'd fill up all of their water, or their barrels of water at the Ganges River, because according to all the logs, the Ganges River water was the only water that would last all the way back to England, right?
Okay.
It wouldn't spoil. Okay. And that was always a known thing. And the belief was the goddess Ganges cleansed herself, right? The goddess Ganges lived in the Ganges River, and they believed that the Ganges River cleansed itself, right?
Okay.
You have about 1 billion people that live along the Ganges River. They dump sewage in it. They bathe their infants in it. They wash their clothes in it. They go swimming in it, right? It is technically should be a cesspool. And yet there's been no massive breakout of
sepsis
of
or like
plague or anything like that, right? So some microbiologists went to explore this, because this was kind of a crazy phenomenon that really no real illness has come out of the Ganges River. Like, does it really purify itself? They analyzed the water, and they realized that there was an organism in the water that actually could multiply very, very quickly based on its food source. And it ate bacteria. So whenever there was a large amount of bacteria in the water, this organism would go from like a couple parts per trillion to like just massive amounts of this organism.
And it's eating all the bacteria. So basically, as the bacteria, okay, so it's almost as though the dirtier the water is, the more of it will exist, which is ultimately cleansing the water.
It would cleanse the water. And then as soon as the food source was gone, the organism would die out. Whoa. And go back down.
Whoa.
Right? So think about an agent like that is when it needs a task, it creates as many of itself that it needs to create to fulfill whatever it needs to fulfill, and then it goes away.
No, really. Like I'm picturing. You ever watched Gundam before?
No.
Oh, okay. It's I'm basically it's a really popular anime series, but in the series there's a Gundam is a big robot basically that someone's riding in, and it's like a war machine.
Yeah.
But I'm picturing like myself in this thing, and it's just like growing and expanding to like all the tools that I needed to have. Yeah. And then the second I don't need the tools anymore, it's just like it's like, okay, now it's simple again.
Yeah. But remember, to expand, what it needs is
it needs a fuel source, or
it needs compute.
Compute. Yeah.
Yeah.
Brain power.
Where are you going to brain power?
Boom. Yeah.
Where are you going to get the compute from in real time, in anonymous, decentralized fashion,
where someone else can't stop you from getting access to it?
Getting access to it, and the providers are compensated in real time through a decentralized network. That's why we created Morpheus.
One place. Yeah. That's a great example. Wow. This is also why I think that a inference reserve is going to be arguably more important than a financial reserve for nation states in the future, and like collections of people.
Yes.
Because you will need to know, like, to use all of these tools that you need to survive and function and like operate on a global economy and international affairs. You're going to need to know that you have X amount of inference available to you at all times.
Yes.
And you cannot take the risk of having that inference being locally ran in singular places where somebody can access it, and like no one can come and bomb my country's inference centers if my inference centers live everywhere.
Yeah.
Right? Because they won't even know I won't even know where they are, but it doesn't matter where they are as long as I have access to it.
There have been more applications to open nuclear power plants in the past year than I think in the last like 30 years or something. It's crazy, right?
The propaganda finally died down on anti-nuclear.
And obviously Trump is elected, right. And people saw the writing on the wall that AI compute is going to be just an incredibly energy intense resource that we have to have if we're going to stay ahead in this world. Okay, so China's doing it, the U.S. is doing it. Just about any first world nation state is looking at this, right? Now, here's the thing with AI compute.
Yeah.
Is it's not a resource that you can ramp up and ramp down on power usage. When AI compute is online, it has to stay online to stay relevant and usable.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, that's what's called an inflexible load on the power grid. Okay. So If you have a flexible load, like say someone that's running their air conditioning unit. So the example I'll often use is like Palm Springs. In the middle of summer, Palm Springs is using a huge amount of electricity because everyone's running their AC units. But then in winter, no one has their AC units running. So it's very low electricity usage. Okay. So that's a seasonal load. Okay. AI compute is not seasonal. It's not seasonal. It's not flexible. It is a consistent load that you have to run 100% of the time.
All the time.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, here's the problem with that is power production is not that consistent. So you have to overbuild your power production.
You always need to have access to more power than you need.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So the reason I say all this is because whenever you have a inflexible or a non-flexible load, you have to pair it with a flexible load because a power grid always has to be balanced. Okay, electricity this is the misnomer is there's a waste of electricity, right? Well, electricity is not wasted. Electricity can only be created when it's being used.
Right.
Okay. Electricity is not actually created until you flip on the switch for your light bulb.
Unless if we somehow create much better batteries.
Unless we create,
don't
which
have
is
them yet.
yeah.
Yes.
Australia has
Just out of curiosity, do you know like what's the longest battery life that we have?
I do not know that.
Because like ideally, eventually we'll create some type of system where I can store electricity for years or months or whatever. We just don't have that
but
yet.
the amount of power we can store in a battery is just not even substantial. It doesn't even move the needle compared to how much power we actually use. Right.
Which is why, to your point, like you need to actually use it to create it. You can't just like create it and be like, oh, here's our storage of electricity.
So one of the best actual, and I'll get back to what I was saying here in a second.
Yeah, sorry.
One of the best actual energy storage systems that we have is actually a hydroelectric facility in California called Helms. And what it is, there's two different lakes where one lake is higher than the other, and then Helms power production facility sits between it, right? So when the power is needed, they let the water run from the high lake to the low lake through the turbines, and they create electricity. At night, when the power isn't needed, they reverse the pumps. They pump water from the lower lake back up to the upper lake and reset it for the next day of needed power.
So they can just reuse the same water.
So they can reuse the same water.
But they're using the electricity that they wouldn't have used otherwise to pump the water
It's like
back.
a battery.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So it's like a really, really big battery.
That's interesting. Okay.
So that's being able to store potential energy, right? A battery is just simply doing the same thing. If you two different lakes, you have an anode and a cathode, and you're just
moving the resource. You're good. Moving the resource back and forth.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
So that's all battery is. Now, a power grid, the only time you actually generate electricity is when you're using it. That's how you get electron flow. Okay. When you have a inflexible load or a non-flexible load, you have to pair it with a flexible load to balance the grid. Okay. So that means that if you're producing 6 gigawatts and you have a non-flexible load of between 4 and 4.5 gigawatts, then you have to have a flexible load between
1 and 2.
Or 2, around 2 gigawatts of flexible load, right? To basically take up whatever your non-flexible load is using.
Yeah.
Okay. And that is really, really critical. Okay. Now, if only there was a technology that could be a limitless flexible load.
Like mining.
Like Bitcoin mining.
Yeah.
And this is what's so powerful about Bitcoin mining. And this is why you see every publicly traded miner in the United States right now is partnering with AI compute.
Okay. So it's not just that you have excess energy because you don't. It's just to get the amount of energy you need to do the thing that you want, you need to inherently like allow there to be an excess, but you have to use all of it.
Yes.
And to use all of it, the thing to like fill that gap, flexible load, is the Bitcoin mining.
Yes.
But if you have something like a massive demand for inference, same thing, you still need to have more power than you actually need. Otherwise, you run the risk of running out of power. But it doesn't work where it's just like, oh, I have excess power because it has to go somewhere.
No, it has to go somewhere.
So you compare the two.
The Bitcoin network is the somewhere that it goes. Because remember, you have an economic issue too, where you can't just burn electricity for the sake of burning electricity because that costs a lot of money in fuel.
Yeah.
Right? So you have to have a customer.
Right.
Well, AI compute, that's the difference. And this is what a lot of like miners that want to get into AI compute, this is where they forget about this, is the Bitcoin network is a customer.
Yeah.
And the Bitcoin network will take 100% of the hash rate you can throw at it, and it will compensate.
It'll use it no matter what.
It will use it no matter what. That's the beauty of the way the difficulty of the network is designed, is it will compensate
difficulty
you,
adjusts
right?
on its own,
and it adjusts every 2 weeks. Now, AI compute is not the same. AI compute only is useful when there's actually a customer using the inference. And we are still on-ramping and bootstrapping customers into the AI world, and we're trying to stay ahead of it. But you never really know what the load on your AI compute is going to be, so it has to be online all the time.
Right.
And you can't just turn it off.
Yeah, and you need to be accessing the amount of electricity you would need, but again, you have to spend it.
Yes.
And so if the two most important resources at a large scale on Earth are some type of exchange and storage of value and access to inference, Morpheus and Bitcoin are extremely complementary to one another as 100%. A pair. Arguably the most complementary to one another.
Yes.
Especially even more so, actually, now that I think about it, because I'm a huge fan of Ethereum and some of these other smart contract platforms just in general. The more decentralized, the better is kind of my thought process behind that. But even with something like Ethereum moving to proof of work, or proof of stake rather, which is using 1% of the total compute, it doesn't, I'm not saying it doesn't pair well with Morpheus. I'm just saying that aspect of it from a compute provider perspective doesn't really pair that well, because you would need to run a bajillion validators to offset the amount of electricity, but Bitcoin inherently does, because it will consume everything you give it.
Yeah.
No matter what.
And not to plug my project too hard, but there's actually only one project on the face of the earth that actually works with Bitcoin mining and
Morpheus,
AI and Morpheus, which is called Lumerin.
That was the best sneaky. He Trojan horsed me so bad. That was a masterclass. What a plug. I'm not even mad. No, that was so good. No, seriously though, wow. Okay. No one has ever framed the compute side of things to me in that way. That's why I'm so glad I'm talking to you about this. There's no one better to talk to about this, by the way, everyone listening. Wow.
So Lumerin runs a Web3 hash power marketplace with a hash power grid. So miners can put their hash power for sale, and people can route the hash power, buy and sell the hash power as a commodity. Morpheus is a compute grid where people can buy and sell compute through hosting like a commodity.
Right. So if you're a compute provider to Morpheus, let's get back to Morpheus really quick. So if I'm a compute provider specifically to Morpheus, but to your point, they have to use the electricity. They're paying for it regardless. So, okay, here's a question actually. In practical terms, if I'm a compute provider, I'm ultimately paying for the electricity from an electric company. Yep. So I guess in theory, I don't have to use everything that I'm paying for. It has to go somewhere, but who's actually making that decision? So I'm either losing out economically by not paying for it, or they are using it for something else, probably some type of I don't know what. And it could be Bitcoin mining. It could be anything.
You have to remember a general consumer of electricity, they only pay for what they use.
Oh yeah,
right.
Corporations are contracting regardless.
A large entity that's like an at-scale miner or at-scale AI facility, they pay for electricity whether they use it or not.
Right.
Right.
But they can use all of it. So if they want to economically maximize that, anything that they're not using on the inference side, they would then want to offload, which is why something like a Lumerin allows them to do that, because now they can say, I have this excess capability. Let me throw it on Lumerin and sell it as Bitcoin hash rate if they don't want to mine it themselves.
Yes.
Because presumably if they did want to mine it themselves, they would be a Bitcoin miner.
And our goal and vision is to make it as easy as possible to both put your flexible load and your non-flexible load into the same market dynamic. Yeah. So put all of your non-flexible load into Morpheus, put all your flexible load into the hash power marketplace on Lumerin, and you have a one-stop, basically grid system for balancing these facilities.
And then wow. All right, so my meme of a strategic more reserve is less of a meme than I thought it was, because if we have a strategic Bitcoin reserve and you pair them together, it's actually the perfect pairing. assuming that you need both of those resources, which again is store of value and then access to inference.
Now, the Morpheus token works very differently than Bitcoin, right?
Right. Yeah.
Morpheus token is like having an equity in the compute network, and you can use it to stake to get compute. You can use it to stake to back builders. The Morpheus token's utility is very, very different than the Bitcoin token.
Right. This is what I was trying to get at before, by the way, when I was trying to say that, like, you don't necessarily have to be the biggest fan of crypto to understand like the value proposition of Morpheus. Because like, again, it's obviously a crypto project in the sense that the token itself lives on crypto rails, but the actual like use case for the token is the AI inference and ultimately
Absolutely.
like the access to compute and modeling and agentic AI. It's not really about the token. The token is a method of delivering the other things. That's what I was trying to say before, and you much more eloquently put it. Yeah.
And every nation state on Earth will have AI facilities, Bitcoin mining facilities, and if they're smart, they'll be tied into Morpheus.
Yeah. Boom. All right. That was amazing. Do you have any final thoughts, Ryan, that you would like to leave? I mean, we can end it right there, but if there's anything else you'd like to leave the community with, please, floor is yours.
Man, if I were to summarize like what drives me, and just to end on kind of a more of a personal thought, is that we don't get a second chance on this earth to make a difference. We get so many goes around the sun, and then we're done, right? So I had to take a step back in my life and really analyze what's really important to me, and what type of world do I want to leave to my kids, and what is that going to look like? And I've determined that liberty, freedom, sovereignty, and freedom of access to information is the best thing that I can put my time into, because I truly believe that there are evil people in this world that want to control. They want to limit and censor and take away from others. And I don't want my kids to be beholden to that type of system.
Right.
I want to empower them to have their own banking, their own sovereignty, their own access to information, and the knowledge of how to use it. I often use the analogy of, and I'll close with this terrible analogy. There was a survival guide that was printed by the U.S. government for special forces that were going into the rainforest in South America, and the guide was how to survive an anaconda attack. And it was several steps, and it said, step 1, you lie perfectly still. Step 2, the anaconda is going to start to swallow you. Let it swallow you up to your waist. Step 3. Just, stay perfectly still, and it's going to work up to your chest. Step 4, you're going to plunge the knife up through the anaconda's, head, rip it up to your chest as hard as you can, and free yourself. And then step 5 was make sure you have a knife and make sure it's very sharp. Right? And when I read that, I just like sitting there scratching my head going, whoa, they have them out of order.
Yeah, we didn't start with the knife.
You did not start with the correct order, right? Because by the time you're step 4, if you got to step 5 and you didn't have a knife, you're done for.
Yeah.
Right. So I use that analogy because I liken it to what I want to leave my kids is I want to start with step 5 and say, I'm going to provide them with the tools and the resources they need, that if any type of government entity or institution tries to capture, control, or dictate who they're going to be in this world, they have the tools they need to free themselves.
They can cut the head off of the snake.
Bingo.
Beautiful. Thanks for being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you again to Ryan Condron for joining Brainpower Episode 7. His insights and experience are extremely valuable. I love getting to sit down and talk to people like him. And if you are a person like him, especially building within the Morpheus ecosystem or decentralized AI in general, I would love to have a conversation with you about it. Now, this is the point of any content creator's piece of content that none of us like, but we have to do anyway. If you enjoy Brainpower, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel on whichever platform it is that you're using to consume this. Also, check out the Brainpower Builder subnet on the Morpheus Builder dashboard and consider staking some more tokens to the project. There may be some rewards in the work for stakers. Anyway, appreciate you as always, and I will see you next week.
I'm trying to free your mind, but I can only show you the door. You're the one that has to walk through it.
You're listening to Brain Power.